Okay, it's time for another PlayCanvas tutorial, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to create a gravitational field and that will attract objects that are falling through space. And some of the concepts I'm going to be showing here is this notion of adding forces to bodies. So what you see here in this kind of image is I'm going to create this sphere. The sphere will have a larger invisible sphere, which I'll call the gravitational field, that will pull everything that falls within that larger sphere towards the center of this blue sphere. So it'll be sort of like a planetary gravitation in a very simple sense. So I'm also going to illustrate how to do create arrays, attribute arrays, and pass those into scripts. So to start with, I assume in this video that you have a PlayCanvas account. There's three different tiers. One is free, one is, and you get 250 megabytes of storage. One is for, I think, $15 a month. And that's 1 gigabyte. That's what I've got. And then there is a organizational one that's $50 a month, and you get 10 gigabytes. So bring up playcanvas.com, and then I've got some projects here. And what I'm going to demonstrate, this is what our goal is, and I will just play this, show you how it works. Essentially, you got this blue sphere, and we've got three different types of objects. Cones, spheres, and boxes or cubes. And as you can see, if they're far away enough, far from the gravitational field, which is around here, they don't get sucked into it. But if they get close enough, they come in. And then you can actually use these things. These objects are called rigid bodies, and you can actually assign different levels of bounciness. So I kind of put a high bounciness on the spheres and a low bounciness on the cubes, and higher friction on the cubes as well. And so you can adjust all these sort of things. I'll show how to do that. So we're going to reproduce this from scratch, since all these videos are building something from scratch. This is sort of based on a blog, I think, that had something similar to it, but it was fairly old and it didn't actually play correctly, so I kind of revised it and enhanced a bit so I could illustrate this. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to pick this model viewer starter kit because it gives you a default camera interaction with the camera, and I don't want to add all that code in. So we'll create this. And so now we go into the editor, and if we just it comes in with a default scene, so we'll click on this main scene, and if I just run it, it has kind of a default demo here with a skybox, kind of a blurred skybox, and this cube here. So we're going to get rid of that, but I'm going to keep the camera. Go back into here, and I'm going to get rid of the model, and then the cube map is this city. I'm going to get rid of these because I don't need them. I just want to have a black background. And oops, I think I didn't want to do that, but I'll delete this. And I'm going to create a default, let's see where we get cube map here. And then to set the cube map, we'll just call this skybox. To assign this to the scene, you go to Settings, Rendering, and just drag that into here. So if we run this, it should be just black, hopefully. Yes. And let's set this MIP to 1. This is the element of blurriness, so if I ever want to put a, say, a sort of starry skybox on it, I don't forget about that. So, okay, so we go back. Now I've got some notes here, and what I want to do is this is called the scene graph, and we've got the camera and a single light, and I'm going to add a few more items here. And from my notes, I can find it, I'm going to be adding a world. That's going to be the blue sphere. I'm going to add a larger sphere, which is gravitational field. And then we're going to add 2 programming elements. And you can tell it's a program. This has a script associated with it, with the double, greater than, less than symbols here. And this is going to be an object pool. This will contain the objects, so we'll probably create 100 or 200 of these objects, and then there will be an object spawner. So we'll also show how to dynamically create 3D objects, which could be very useful. So I'm going to create these elements right now. So create a world, go into here, and I'm going to create a primitive that's going to be a sphere. And I'm going to rename it world. I'm going to have a gravitational field, which is going to be also a sphere. We're going to have an object pool, and this will be just an entity, so it won't have any model associated with it, but it will have a script associated with it. So I'll add a component and do this. I haven't got scripts yet for it, but I will soon, and we'll just call that object pool. We'll create one of the objects. There's going to be 3 different types. There's going to be a box or cube, sphere, and cone. So I'll create first one here, and that's going to be a primitive of type box, and I'll call that template, because this thing, even though it's in the scene graph, I'm going to disable it. It's going to be cloned programmatically, when it's needed. And then there's going to be 2 others, but I want to fill in all the attributes of this first. Then I'm going to just clone it, make the slight changes. And then the last part is going to be the object spawner, and that's also going to be just an entity. So we've got that, and we'll add a script to that. Or at least a placeholder for a script. Okay, so let's go back and fill out what the world actually is comprised of. And I have some notes on how these attributes, so I've got a little text file here that describes what these attributes are, and essentially where the world is going to reside, and what sort of components it has. So this world is going to be basically positioned at the origin and have no rotation, and it's going to be a scale of 20. It's already a model of a sphere. It's going to have a collision component, and it also is going to have a rigid, and I misspelled rigid. Going to be a rigid body, and it's going to have some characteristic of friction 1, and restitution is the level of bounciness. So 0 is no bounciness, 1 is high bounciness, and it will have no script. So we'll go into here, but it will have a material. So I'm going to create a folder, and I'm going to call it world. And I'm going to add a material to this eventually. So I come into here, and I'm going to change the scale in the XYZ direction to 20, 20, 20. And there's a trick. If you ever, get something way out there, you can hit the F key, and that will focus in on whatever object you've got selected here. So this is kind of a drab looking sphere. We want to actually create a material for it. But before we do that, we want to add the collision so that when these objects come down, there is some mechanism so it can detect collision. So this is a collision detector. So, and this also has a type, and since this is a sphere, I'm going to use a sphere as the collision object. And typically the radius of this thing is going to be half of the scale. We now add a rigid body. This adds physics to the object so that it will respond to gravity. Now in this case it's not going to be moving, so I'm going to leave it as static. So there'll be the other objects will bounce into this. And then one final thing is I'm going to go into this world and create a material for it. And in order to make a color, I've got defined here a material color somewhere. So I got world material, and it's got this kind of bluish look, and I'm going to add that in. So to do that, I'll call this world material, go into diffuse, go into the tint, and then just plug in the values that I had defined for it, which is 38, 77, and 221. Also, I want it to look a little bit more metallic. So if we go into the specular piece here, turn on metallic, this looks pretty good, and I'll just leave it the way it is. And then I'll come back to the actual world itself and then drag this right into it. So now if we launch the program, we should have this kind of sphere here. Now, because we've added a rigid body, and we're going to be adding, before I go into this, let me create the gravitational field. So the gravitational field is going to be a larger, essentially it's going to be a larger sphere, and it's going to have a very small scale. It doesn't really matter what this is. What's important is the collision part of this thing is going to be 32. So if we go into this, the gravitational field does not actually need a model, so we can get rid of that. We add a collision component. It's going to be a sphere, and we'll make it 32. And the scale, I think we could just leave it as is. So now anything that falls within this outer sphere will get sucked into it. Now this particular component, this particular entity will have a script, and we'll come back to that and assign the script to it. It has to know when something is crashed into it. The next step here is to create this box, and the properties of the box are going to be slightly different. We're going to have we're going to position it in this particular case. Probably doesn't matter where this is positioned because this is disabled. The spawner is actually going to position it where it needs. So, but I'll place it up here so we can see it. It will have a box as a collision. it's going to have a rigid body, and that rigid body, we're going to make it dynamic, and we're going to set it, the friction to be 1 and the restitution, which is the bounciness, to 0. So we want the boxes not to really bounce so much. So go into there, and we add a collision. It's going to be a box, and typically this value, the half extent, should be half of whatever scale that we have here. Leave it as that, and then we'll add the rigid body, and this is what we change. Since this is going to be actually moving, we'll switch this to dynamic, and we're going to make the friction 1 and restitution 0. Okay, and then we're going to set the location of that in the y-axis. If you look at this, red, green, blue, this corresponds to X, Y, and Z in that order. So to place it up above, it'll be along the y-axis. So I'm going to give the position to be something like 25. And so it's going to be somewhere up here. Now, if we go into this, run this as is, we shouldn't see that box because we've got it disabled. Get rid of some of these. So next step, is one thing that we're going to do. Let's turn this on and see what happens. So I'm going to enable this. See if this actually appears. Yeah, okay, so it doesn't appear. So never mind on that. So this is just basically a template. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create in this scripts directory, I'm going to drag in some pre-existing scripts and we can look at the code and see how it works. But for now, I'm going to just assign these scripts to these different objects. So I need a collider. So I just kind of drag this JavaScript right into this directory here. I need a force. The force is going to be assigned to the moving objects. And I need the object pool, which will be the container for the objects. And then I need a spawner. And the spawner spawns boxes and other things as well. So to be able to assign these guys to these different objects, world will have no script. It's the gravitational field that needs a collision script. So we go in here, click, create a script, and then select add script, and then look for the collider. That's here. If you do a parse, if there were any attributes that you would assign ahead of time, these are sort of like initializers, they would be here, but collider doesn't have any predefined attributes. But some of these other scripts do. So now if I go to the box template and then do the same thing, add a script component, and then assign force to it, this will assign a force going towards the center of the sphere. Click on parse, it does not have any attributes as well. Go into object pool, it already has placeholder for scripts, and we're going to add the object pool script to that. This one does have attributes, and this defines the different types of objects that we want to put in here. Right now we've only got one defined, which is a box, but we're going to add a sphere and a cone as well. So I'm going to set this to 1, hit return, and then I can click on this and then select this box template. So this will be actually passed into the code. The pool max, I'll set it up for about 100 for now. And that will create a pool of 100 objects that's going to drop. And then the materials, well, let's create some materials. So let's go into create a folder and call it materials, and this will be the materials that go on to these moving objects like the cube. Go into here, do a right click and say I want to create a material, and this is just going to be a basic red material to start off with, so I'll just call it red material, and then go to diffuse, change the tint, and essentially now I got a red material, and I'm going to assign that to this template object. And there's a slot here for material. I'll just drag it into here. Now this material as well is going to be assigned to, because I'm going to have several of these different colors, I'm going to assign that to the object pool. And so since we've got only one right now, I give it one, and then I can drag this in. This is called an array of attributes. Very handy to be able to create arrays and pass things into it. So the program itself, the object pool itself, will read these objects. It'll look at the material and stuff, and it'll basically assign this material dynamically to this template and dynamically create the box. So now, because this thing is in space, by default, the physics is set to down, basically a gravitational force going down, and we don't want that. It kind of screws up the demo. So I'm going to set this to 0, since the only gravitational force is going to be towards the center in this gravitational field. So if things didn't work, it was because this thing wasn't set. So I've set this to 0. Next step is to assign a script to the object spawner and put this in here. Okay, and there's another trick. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go into here, and in order to bring up the code, there's a code editor. You can click on any one of these JavaScripts, and it creates an editor here, and you can look at the logic for each of these. Now there is a little trick so that when we run this app, that the camera gets centered at some sort of object. So if you go into camera and you look at orbit camera, it has some attributes that you can preset. And this one down here, focus entity, what that does is it focuses on whatever object you want in the scene. And since we want to focus in on the world, we'll click on this and click on there and have world in here. So now if we run it and see what happens actually. So now it's actually creating some of these objects, but it's not looking quite right, and that's because we've got to put the spawner at a higher place. But it's getting sort of where we want. The attraction now, you can kind of see the attraction. Also the light is, we probably need more lights or adjust the current light. So let's go back, and the object spawner is set at the origin, and that's not what we want. In my notes, I've set the object spawner somewhere in position 535.5. So instead of just directly above it at 35, I've offset a bit so that it sort of clings to the front and the back, or sort of the front. So let's add that, because it's going to spawn at the location of where this object spawner is. So we'll go into here, add 5, 35, 5, and now we can go back and do a refresh. So now it's coming from above. You can kind of see, but we still need to adjust the light a bit. It's a little bit dark. So one thing we can do in in lieu of adding another light, we can add some emissiveness, which is sort of like emanates light. So if you go to the material and open up this emissive component here, you can give it sort of a, we pick a similar color blue, we give it a little bit more of a glow, so you can see the glow a little bit better from different directions. So that's just a trick. Okay, so we're almost there. We're going to just add a couple more objects. It seems like it's doing what it should be doing. Coming through, as you can see, these guys are far enough away that they just kind of go down to oblivion. And the other ones are kind of, since there's not much friction, I mean there's a lot of friction on this and not much bounciness, it kind of sticks to it. So let's add some spheres. So I'm going to take this guy and duplicate it. Why did that not duplicate? Yeah. So we duplicate that, call this sphere template. And the sphere template I set to a restitution of 1, so I get maximum bounciness on. So I'll move this from, make this friction, less friction, and then move this up to here. Okay, so now I've added another sphere. How do I get that, the spawner to add that? All I have to do is go to the pool and come in here and say, oh, I have another game object. So I'll click on that. Select entity, select the sphere template, and then that's going to be assigned. I also want to add some more colors as well, and we'll do that next. But there is one other item in this. We got to change this box to sphere, and that's collision, and then also the type is going to be a sphere. So this is set up correctly because the radius is half of the scale. And let's see what happens. These should all be. So now we've got some balls bouncing as well, but they're all kind of the same color. So to add some more materials, I can go into materials and create a new material. This time we'll create a green one. And then this one's just going to be a simple diffuse. So get absolute green. And so we have this object here. Okay, so now we got the material. We go to our object pool. We say we got two materials. Two materials. Drag this guy over to here. And now we go to here, and then I do it. Oh, darn it! If I go to here and refresh, we should have green with these bouncy balls, and then as they collide, they get sort of wedged in between here, so they'll eventually cluster around the cubes that are in there. So we're pretty close to ending, but I just want to also mention one other thing that's of note. This collision type, so when we go to a box and we say, okay, I'm going to create a collision, there's only a few of these collision objects, sphere, capsule, cylinder, mesh, and so forth. There is this option for a mesh. So if you want an object to behave that's a little bit more irregularly shaped, it's not there. I think this, yeah, this does not have a cone. You can actually use the object itself. Typically you want, for the collision detector, a smaller type object for performance reasons. But let's now continue on. And what I'm going to do is show how you can, I'm not going to go through Blender, but I'm going to show if you've created if you've gone into Blender, create a cone, and then export it out as an FBX file. The FBX file can be imported into PlayCanvas. In a previous video I showed how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag that in, go into the, I'm going to create, say, a new folder, call it objects, and then drag, go into here, drag that cone in here. You'll see here I'm loading it. If you see it pause. So what it'll do is you'll have the FBX here, but you'll actually be working with the JSON part of the cone. And in this case here, what I can do is I can duplicate this sphere. Yeah, I think what happens is I click on here, I haven't actually selected it. Do duplicate, call this cone template, or cone. And what we're going to do is this will be a mesh, and it has an asset that you can use, and I can drag this cone into here, and so I'll use the cone itself as the collision object. And then this guy is going to be a cone, the model itself. Yes, that's going to be a cone. We now add this new object to our pool. So we got a third object. Select the entity. And we'll leave the materials alone. So actually, I'm going to add one more color, just for variety. Let's come into here, diffuse, and I'm going to do, let's do a yellow, and call that yellow material. And now you can tell, go back to the pool, add a third material we can drag into here, then refresh this. And so now we've got three types of objects. And what I'm going to do is adjust a little bit. No, actually I'm going to leave it as is because I think the defaults are fine. So the cone is, I think it's got 50% restitution, 50% friction. Let's see what it actually has. Maybe not, because I cloned it. So yeah, this one has a lot of bounciness. So if I change that, it might be a little bit less bouncy. Yeah, so it doesn't bounce quite as much as the spheres. Now it's interesting, see what happens. There's a lot of friction that's on the squares, so that when they hit, let's see what happens if we adjusted that friction to 0. See if there's any difference. Will these boxes start to slide? There is I think there's some friction on the large sphere. Yeah, so now you see these kind of things spinning around a bit more, and see now it slides. So I had the other extreme when I came in there, it just got stuck, but now they're kind of sliding all over the ball. So this is cool. I was going to explain the code, but I thought maybe it's better to just explain this if people are not interested necessarily in the code, but how to do this. In this video, it's already 35 minutes, and then in the follow-up on here, I'll sort of go into the code and explain why that works. So I don't want to get these videos too long, too much over. But it's a pretty fun little the exercise. And you learn a few things about how to attach scripts, how to dynamically create these entities, how to create these attributes. So when we go to object pool, we can pass in these attributes to the code, which is really super nifty, and even the objects themselves. We'll go into the code next to describe how that's done. The code's relatively simple. Anyways, I'm concluding this, and then we'll continue with a follow-up.